What was mankind's greatest achievement? Was it Putin? Maybe wheels on a suitcase? No, I think actually it was the trip to the moon. Back in 1969, a giant rocket was constructed, the Saturn V, essentially a huge fuel tank. The astronauts were sitting in the command module up here. Well, that's this in my model. And that is the only part of this vehicle that came back to Earth. The rest was completely disposable. All right. Now, in '69, landing on the moon, Neil Armstrong, of course, the famous phrase, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, followed by successful landing, Apollo 12. And the next year, 1970, Apollo 13 was to land on the moon. But we know what happened. Houston, we have a problem here. The problem was that the service module, which contained an oxygen tank, burst open when the oxygen tank exploded. This meant that the mission to the moon had to be aborted. So here were the astronauts in the command module. Behind them was the surface module, which essentially was useless. And they were also carrying the lunar lander in a compartment behind. When we inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide has to be absorbed somehow, otherwise it would displace the air and the astronauts would suffocate. Well, inside of the command module, there are canisters of lithium hydroxide, and that absorbs the carbon dioxide. However, because of the explosion here, the astronauts could not stay in the command module. There was not enough fuel. The oxygen was to combine with hydrogen for use in the fuel cell to generate the energy. So they had to use the lunar lander as a lifeboat. So here's what happened. They hooked up the lunar lander like this. The astronauts crawled into the lunar lander, and the lunar lander did have some canisters of lithium hydroxide, but not enough, because it was only enough for the few hours that they were to spend on the moon. So here's what they had to do. They had to rescue the canisters from the command module and put them into the lunar lander, except that they were the wrong kind. They didn't fit, not the same canister. So engineers on the ground went to work and came up with a very, very clever plan of how to fit the canisters from the command module into the lunar module. And they used plastics and duct tape, and we held our breath as the astronauts plummeted back towards Earth to see whether or not they would survive. It was really touch and go. But it turned out, of course, that the engineers had been very clever. They devised a way to absorb the carbon dioxide, and it was all done with human ingenuity and with duct tape that saved the life of the astronauts.